Frank, thank you so much. And can I start by saying what an honour it is to be invited to come and talk again to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. I spoke 6 years ago when I just left Tokyo at the end of my ambassadorship. And tonight to be invited to give the annual lecture in memory of Lord Denman, who was, of course, president of the Society for nearly 40 years. I know I'm following in some very distinguished footsteps. And thank you for that, in that invitation, reflecting the fact that Asian affairs should encompass not just East Asia as well as South and Central Asia, but a country, Japan, that for the last 150 years has, in complex and maybe some in somewhat cryptic ways, bridged East and West, the Asia-Pacific region and the wider liberal Western world. All ambassadors, and it's certainly true, all ex-ambassadors run the risk of arguing too stridently that their countries are not paid enough attention by ministers, business, the media, and so on. I'm not going to do that this evening, but I am going to focus a little on the extent to which Japan is something of a conundrum. If you judge Japan by raw economic data, it should be seen as a global powerhouse, one of the financial, cultural and social centres of the world. And it is. Yet I'm still puzzled, as I speak to audiences about Japan, at how many otherwise really well-informed people say to me, but isn't Japan such a small country? This is a country of 126 million people, which is twice the population of the UK, on an archipelago which stretches geographically across a distance equivalent to the distance between Oregon and the Mexican border. And I'm puzzled also as to why Japan attracts less media and public attention than one might have thought appropriate. For a country that, with 1.5% of the world's population, remains still the third largest economy in the world, and it will still, in 30 years' time, be the fifth largest. It has 10% of Fortune 500 companies. It has 13% of the world's financial assets. By some estimates, it accounts for a fifth of the world's research and development, and it is holding three major sporting events, the Rugby World Cup and the Olympics and Paralympics in the next 18 months. And despite all the measurements of economic international relevance one can reel off, and yet, in spite of that, it's also true that in a number of ways, Japan doesn't quite connect with the yardsticks we set for global interconnectedness. Why, for example, are there so few Japanese universities in the world's top 100? There are just two. Why is the English language not a business as well as an academic lingua franca in Japan as it is in other Asian countries? Why is there such a low level of foreign direct investment in Japan? Why does Japan, as a liberal democracy, score so poorly in so many international league tables, such as those relating to women's empowerment or press freedom? Why does Japan, for all its extraordinary and energetic innovation, imagination, and sophistication, often feel like such an oddly insular monoculture? There are, I think, answers to some of these questions. Japan, for example, was never colonized. There is no effective Japanese diaspora in the world, unlike China. There is no effective Japanese linguistic footprint internationally, as there is for Chinese. Japanese conversion to the major Abrahamic faiths has been minimal. Japanese religion has never been exported. The Japanese economic and social system is self-supporting to a remarkable degree. Hence, the very low level of penetration of foreign companies in the Japanese market. There are very few international multilateral giants in the world, in business terms, that operate at more than a niche level in Japan. Hence also the very slow migration in Japan away from Japan-specific regulations and standards. Robert Dujarric, who's a long-time observer of Japan and is director of the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University, observed once, the Japanese live in a world where as soon as they step off the archipelago, they are foreigners, to a much greater degree than any other nation. And some long-time observers of Japan at this point in the discussion say, well, why do we have to judge Japan by these global standards? And I understand their point of view to a degree. A few years ago, I was at a Ditchley conference where I got into an argument with an American official, and he was arguing that Japan should become, as international relations specialists say, a more normal country. By normal, he meant that it should share a much greater degree of the international burden sharing for collective self-defense and play a more active role in that area. But it seemed to me that as we talked about the issue, the conversation around the table saw a number of people extending the word normal to apply to lots of things outside the defence and security world, and saying that Japan needed actively to converge with international standards in social, political and economic areas. And I found myself saying that if I came from a country like Japan with such low levels of violent crime, indeed low levels of any crime, low levels of teenage pregnancies, of drug abuse, of unemployment, of income inequality, and high levels of life expectancy, healthcare, social cohesiveness and stability, I might think that I had something to teach the world rather than learn from it. At the same time, I knew that there were other areas, corporate governance, the transparency of the legal system, as we're seeing with the long-running saga of the arrest of the Nissan boss, Carlos Ghosn, not to mention gender equality, openness to immigration, asylum seekers, and so on, where I would have been much less confident making the case that Japan had the moral high ground. For every friend of Japan who argues, sometimes rather indulgently, that Japan should be seen as the model of a stable, peaceful, prosperous democracy, there will be a more candid friend of Japan who argues that this is willfully ignoring the fault lines of Japanese society and acquiescing in a conformism, in a passivity that is storing up trouble for the future. But whenever I get agitated about Japanese groupthink, I also remember one of my predecessors as ambassador, Sir Sidney Giffard, who started a lecture to the Japan Society with the words, "I never begin a sentence, 'the Japanese are,' without thinking of half a dozen of my Japanese friends to whom I know it does not apply." So, in this talk, I'm going to give a quick historical background sketch of modern Japan, its political and economic structures, and its international relationships. And then I want to explore why we tend not to think of Japan as affected by the populism that is infecting many Western liberal democracies, and ask as well why Japan presents itself still as such a different country. I'm not going to be talking about Japan-Britain relations in any detail, and I'm not going to talk about Japan's view of Brexit, their deep concerns about what we are doing at the moment in that area of policy, but maybe we can pick those issues up in the question and answer session at the end. So, quick historical sketch. I promise it will be really quick. Modern Japan is a century and a half old. 250 years of relative seclusion under the Tokugawa regime were ended by the American Black Ships, 1854, Commodore Perry, and the pressure from the then great powers to open the country to foreign commerce. This in turn led to the end of the shogunate, the restoration of the emperor under an imperial system under Emperor Meiji in 1868, and the establishment of constitutional government. And in the last 30 years of the 19th century, Japan modernized at phenomenal speed. A feudal country became an industrial powerhouse. But it was Japan's dramatic victory over the Imperial Russian Navy in 1904-5 in the Russo-Japanese War, the first time an Asian power had defeated a European one, acclaimed by revolutionaries across the world as a turning point in history. It was that victory which encouraged the Japanese to aspire not just to great power status, but to their own imperial system. And this proved over the first half of the 20th century to be a terrible error. Japan's predatory interest in China led to the Sino-Japanese War of the 1930s and eventually to the moral and physical catastrophe of the Pacific War, ending with, as we all know, the humiliation and pulverization of Japan with the atomic bomb attacks in 1945. As I said earlier on, Japan was never colonized, except probably, we can say, for the 7 years after the end of the Second World War by the US occupation, when the country was rebuilt under the aegis of the United States and a new pacifist constitution imposed, and the Yoshida Doctrine established, named after the then post-war Japanese Prime Minister, Shigeru Yoshida, whereby Japan would be protected militarily by the United States and would be able to concentrate its energies on reconstructing its damaged and destroyed economy. And so, over the next 30 years, protected by trade barriers and turbocharged by an undervalued yen, fueled by outstanding scientific and managerial technological innovation, the economy duly maintained phenomenal levels of growth right up to the oil shocks of the 1970s. And even after the world's currencies had been realigned with the Plaza Accord of 1985, the Japanese economic expansion continued. But, as we all know, the inflation of real estate and asset values could not last, and on New Year's Eve 1989, the bubble burst and Japan entered the lost decades. Over the last 30 years, the economy has grown intermittently, and Japan has remained a prosperous and stable country. But the narrative has been one of adapting to relative long-term decline, not least, of course, because of the demographics of Japan with its aging and shrinking population, rather than the previous narrative of exponential growth. As Frank said, I was 3 times in Japan, and I saw this at first hand in my 3 postings when I arrived in Japan in 1977. The post-war boom was coming to an end, and Japan was coping with the traumatic impact of the first oil shock, and I was there for the second oil shock in 1979, when the price of oil on the spot market in Rotterdam went up to an incredible $40 a barrel. I missed the bubble years, but I went back to Tokyo as the embassy's commercial counsellor in the 1990s, and then Japan was in the middle of these depressing lost decades. When I came back as ambassador in 2008, my Japanese friend said to me, "Third time lucky." But no, I'm afraid the curse of Warren was still quite strong, and a month after I arrived, we hit the global financial crisis. I was looking after the Lord Mayor of London at the time, who was there to promote the City of London. He went down to the Tokyo Stock Exchange to ring the bell for luck. It plunged 10 points immediately. I could see that this was a crisis which Japan had already experienced some years previously, and so from whom we could learn something about the management of the crisis. But this is the world in which we and the Japanese, of course, still find ourselves. So one of the paradoxes about Japan over the last decade has been why, compared with other developed economies in Europe and America, Japanese politics has appeared to remain stable and unaffected by the rise of populism. So before I ask why Japan has managed to insulate itself in this way, let's have a quick word about Japanese post-war political history. Japanese politics since the 50s has been dominated by one party, the Liberal Democratic Party, the Conservative Party. Formed by a merger of 2 right-wing parties in 1955. It's ruled more or less uninterruptedly since then. Business-oriented, broadly pro the US-Japan alliance, not outstandingly ideological. The LDP presided over the growth years and has helped to manage the years of relative decline. It has been helped in more recent years by a change in the electoral system. There used to be a form of first past the post, a form of proportional representation, because there used to be a lot of multi-member constituencies in the lower house of Parliament. But since the mid-90s, that has been replaced by a largely first-past-the-post system. And so the old system where LDP candidates were all arguing with each other and the factional system within the party was tremendously important, because that was a way of organising the different interest groups. That has been weakened and a more majoritarian system has been substituted. And now the issue is how to drive, both through the party and through Parliament, a clear majority in favour of the agreed policy. This has assisted, as I will argue, a much more top-down approach to Japanese politics and a less consensual one. And the role of politicians, I think, is also qualitatively different from what we know in Europe and America. I suppose one aspect of that is the absence of obvious ideological fault lines. You don't, on the whole, in Japan, have the phenomenon of the ideological issue which destroys party leaders and parties, as we are seeing with Brexit and virtually every Conservative Prime Minister and leader over the past 30 years. You haven't quite got that phenomenon in Japanese politics. But that doesn't mean that you don't have very strong Japanese politicians who have clear ideological orientations. One thinks of Nakasone in the 1980s with his sense of building a more confident Japan, asserting itself as a great power in political as well as economic terms, and his close relationship with President Reagan, the Ron Yasu years. One thinks of Koizumi in the early years of the last decade, a much more quirky, maverick LDP politician, finally, positioning himself as an opponent to his own party and bringing in candidates designed specifically to destroy electorally the conservative, stick-in-the-mud diehards who were holding back his privatisation reforms at the post office and other policies to get the Japanese economy moving. But they are the exception rather than the rule, and for the most part, the turnover of Japanese prime ministers has been pretty brisk. Over the last 65 years, there have been 29 of them, compared with 14 in Britain, if you count Harold Wilson twice and include Winston Churchill. And the politician's job for most of that period in Japan has been much more to manage the political and parliamentary processes flowing from the policies developed in the Iron Triangle, as it was called, the triangle of power in Japan. Politicians, the bureaucracy, and business. This Iron Triangle, which was the bedrock of Japanese growth during the years of expansion. Even when I was in Japan for my second tour in the 1990s, we could see that Iron Triangle had lost its lustre. This was partly because of the failure, the bursting of the bubble in 1989, but it was also because of corruption scandals. These had always been there. Prime Minister Tanaka was brought down in the 1970s by the Lockheed bribing scandal. Prime Minister Takeshita and a lot of other politicians, not all of them in the LDP, in other parties as well, were brought down by the Recruit insider share dealing scandal in the 1980s. But on the whole, corruption affected politicians. It did not also taint the bureaucracy. And when it began to taint the civil service, then we saw people become even more radically disaffected from the governmental establishment. And the economy had collapsed. And the perceived response to that policy failure was itself perceived as poor and slow. And the lack of effective leadership supporting economic reforms and the desire among many to have a more aggressive, a less consensual political business model, and the failure of politicians to respond to that. All of that contributed to this malaise. So the LDP lost power briefly in 1993. They reinvented themselves in a temporary marriage of convenience with the Socialist Party, under a socialist prime minister initially. And then with Koizumi, they reinvigorated their nationalist conservative political brand. After Koizumi, we went into another period of rapid turnover of ineffectual prime ministers. And then in 2009, when I was ambassador, the LDP were unceremoniously turfed out of office, and the main opposition party, the Democratic Party of Japan, formed a government. It was a disaster. They proved just as faction-ridden as the LDP. The reality was that they were a mixture of ideologies, left and right, hawks and doves, all united only by the fact that they loathed the LDP. And they made the fatal error of trying to govern without the bureaucracy, whom they considered were compromised by the fact that they'd supported the LDP for so long. But in Japan, which is a country without a very strong think tank culture, as you find in Europe and America, the bureaucracy is where the policy expertise is, and the government, the new DPJ government, trying to govern without the bureaucracy was a recipe for complete catastrophe. So there was an even faster turnover of prime ministers, 3 in 3 years, and by the 2012 election, which was just after I left the ambassadorship, we had Shinzo Abe, who had been prime minister briefly in the previous decade, returned to office as the LDP prime minister. And Abe is now the second longest continuously serving prime minister in Japanese history. He governs in coalition with a smaller, centrist, clean government party, the Komeito, which is linked to a Buddhist sect, not unlike the Liberal Democrats in Britain, not in spiritual terms, but in organisational terms, very powerful in local areas, very effective local organisers. And they are a centrist break on some of the more nationalistic policies that come from the LDP. And Abe has, since he became Prime Minister in 2012, has won 3 general elections, on the whole with relatively small percentages of the popular vote, in an overall vote which is itself going down. People voting in Japanese elections now quite low, 53.7% in the most recent one. But the LDP are riding high because there's no effective opposition to them. The Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, which is the residue of the party which formed the government 10 years ago, is a shadow of itself. And other attempts, most prominently in recent years by the governor of Tokyo, Yuriko Koike, to try and produce a party which is a different centre of power, rival centre of power to Abe. These have not got anywhere. And so there isn't an opposition to the LDP worthy of the name, and there aren't any obvious successors to Abe within the LDP, although it's fair to say that his support is stronger among parliamentarians than it is in the grassroots. Indeed, it's striking that the current rules in the party preclude his continuing as leader of the party after 2021, but there's talk of changing those rules because there isn't an obvious successor to him on the horizon. Why do we have this apparent absence of populism in Japan? In one sense, I think it's easy to guess the reasons. In Europe, in America, the mainsprings of populism are economic and cultural. Well, the Japanese economy, while growing pretty insipidly compared with the glory years, and certainly compared with the exponential growth in China, is still stable. Japan is still a rich country. Indeed, there is a slightly perverse argument that as the population shrinks, yet the technological and innovative strength of the Japanese economy continues to grow, the Japanese are finding this curious sweet spot in which the rise in GDP per capita is among the strongest in the G7, although it's not easy to see how that could be sustained indefinitely. Income inequality is growing, but it's still much lower in Japan than in many other developed countries, although there are danger signals. In Japan, it's much greater in Tokyo than in the rest of the country. There is the same sort of detachment of the capital from the rest of the national economy. It's much greater between different categories of workers, temporary workers and permanent staff workers. But nonetheless, compared with many other developed countries, Japan is still an income equal country. The debt mountain is very high, 240% of gross domestic product, but almost entirely serviced domestically, and not involving the international markets. As I said earlier, Japan is a self-supporting, self-contained economy still in many ways. And the other mainspring of populism in our countries, of the cultural debate, is much less prominent in Japan, because the cultural space in a society which is so linguistically and ethnically homogenous is much less contested. On the whole, you don't find Japanese media polarizing the political debate as you do in Britain and America. It's hard to see a populist insurgency like Five Star in Italy or Les Gilets Jaunes in France seizing or getting traction in the political debate in Japan. And again, on the whole, voters have rarely been attracted to the ultra-right and ultra-left-wing political alternatives in the modern era. Now, there are extreme right-wing politicians in Japan who have tried to channel frustration with the state of the world and this Japanese consensus. There was a man who was governor of Tokyo, Shintaro Ishihara, who formed a party in the 2012 election with another populist demagogue leader, but it only translated into a relatively small number of seats in Parliament, and in turn that party has split up and merged with lots of other parties, some of them indeed on the left rather than the right. In the 2014 election for governor of Tokyo, there was an extreme right-wing candidate, a former head of the Air Self-Defense Force, Air Marshal Tamogami, who had been sacked from his role in the Japanese Air Force because of his nakedly revisionist views of the Pacific War. And Japan doesn't have to apologise for anything that it did in the 1930s and 40s. And the Prime Minister of the day that sacked him on the spot, he stood for election for governor of Tokyo, and he got about 12% of the vote, which is more than one might have liked to see, but less than critics of ultranationalism in Japan might have expected. But one of the points that some commentators make about populism in Japan is that Abe himself neutralises this, because he is in his own way a populist. He's not an outsider. He comes from a very distinguished, as many Japanese politicians do, Japanese political dynasty. His father was foreign minister. His grandfather, Nobusuke Kishi, was prime minister in the late 1950s. He was the prime minister who forced through the US-Japan Security Alliance. His own career was deeply problematical because he had been part of the wartime Japanese government, although he was never actually... He was arrested in 1945 but not prosecuted for war crimes. And his grandson, Abe, present Prime Minister, is a mixture of nationalist and pragmatist. On the one hand, he comes from a very strongly nationalistic wing of the LDP, indeed, the revisionist side of the party. His mission in politics, in part, is to rehabilitate his grandfather's legacy. And that, in his terms, means empowering the younger generation to turn the page in terms of history, so that they can look to the future without feeling the need constantly to apologise for the past. And to address what Abe and his supporters will argue is an outmoded US-imposed constitution. But the pragmatist in Abe recognises that these policies of rehabilitating the past and constitutional reform carry a powerful negative charge in a country that is still strongly pacifist and more generally within the Asia-Pacific region among Japan's geographical neighbours. So what does this mean in practice? And should we see Abe as Abe's administration as reflecting sensible conservatism or sinister authoritarianism? Let me say a quick word about this business of turning the historical page. The focus for this was the statement which Abe issued on the 70th anniversary of the end of the Pacific War in 2015. The formal Japanese position before that date was set out by the socialist Prime Minister Murayama in the 1990s. He issued the statement on the 50th anniversary in 1995. The Murayama statement made explicitly clear that Japan apologised for its wartime actions. It described Japan's rule in East Asia as colonial. It described its military as having been aggressive, and its foreign policy in the 1930s as wrong. These statements were endorsed, and these are powerful statements in terms of Japanese politics. These statements were endorsed by every prime minister who has come after Murayama, including Abe, when he was prime minister 10, 12, 13 years ago. Abe Mark II wanted to go a little further. He took detailed advice from an advisory panel of historians, journalists, politicians, and former officials. He set out the historical context to what had happened during the war, which of course invited accusations of revisionism. But he also, for the first time in his statement, mentioned former prisoners of war, and he included a reference to the so-called comfort women in Korea, these women who were sex slaves. This is a phrase the Japanese will never use about them, but it is the correct way of describing them. The comfort women is a rather disgraceful euphemism. And Abe included a reference to them with a rather coy phrase about women behind the battlefields whose honour and dignity were severely injured. Moreover, in reiterating the need for Japan to squarely face the history of the past, he also asserted the national and international values of Japan today, in order, quoting, to establish a basis on which current and future generations of Japanese should not feel eternally obliged to apologise for their parents' and grandparents' actions. Within Japan, Abe's statement received broad support. Outside Japan, there was criticism, particularly in China, who disapproved of his tinkering with the Murayama text. But the criticism was much more moderate than criticism from China about previous perceived transgressions and Japanese insincerity about history. So one concludes that Abe's attempt to walk this tightrope between his different constituencies had been successful. The nationalists and the revisionists on one side, who object to Japan's continually having to apologise, the pragmatists on the other, who recognise that an apology does need to be made, does need to be repeated, and that Japan's relations with its regional partners depend upon its tone. And not just relations with its partners, but Japan's ability to pursue the sort of activist foreign policy that Abe and other politicians want to see. Nonetheless, there are those in Japan who deplore any derogation from the Murayama text and see Abe's politics as more threatening to liberal democracy. And here, the debate tends to focus on the proposals for constitutional reform. Because Abe wants to amend the constitution, and he specifically wants to redress its emphasis on pacifism and human rights. Under Article 9 of the Japanese constitution, which the Americans imposed in 1947, Japan renounces war. It renounces the threat of force to settle disputes, and it undertakes not to maintain military forces. In practice, of course, Japan maintains an army, a navy, and an air force under the name Ground and Maritime Self-Defense Force. And Abe has passed legislation with an effective parliamentary majority, but against some opposition from the public, to enable the self-defence forces to play an active role in collective self-defence. In other words, to come to the assistance of the Americans and other potential military allies in the region if necessary. And there has also been active Japanese participation in United Nations peacekeeping forces around the world since the early 1990s. But the LDP want to go further than this and actually amend the constitution so that it enshrines not only a more active, proactive definition of pacifism, but also changing other provisions in the constitution so as to tilt the references to human rights, including freedom of assembly, away from a liberal interpretation towards a greater emphasis on public order, on social and personal obligations and responsibilities. The Abe administration has introduced state secrets legislation and an anti-conspiracy law, giving the authorities enhanced surveillance powers. All of this intensifies concern and debate about the government's intentions. Now, in order to change the constitution, they have to get a 2/3 majority in the Diet. They can probably achieve that. Then they have to put it to a special referendum of the people. A simple majority will suffice, but the evidence at the moment is that they would have difficulty getting that simple majority because The opinion polls show pretty consistent lack of enthusiasm for what Abe has in mind, and a desire that he should concentrate instead on getting the economy moving again rather than continually tinkering with the constitution. And the Japanese are not very comfortable about referendums. I'm struck by a throwaway remark made by a very senior official, Japanese official, to me the week after the 2016 Brexit referendum, when he said to me, "That will teach you not to hold referendums, won't it?" It's one of the reasons why the Japanese are very uncomfortable about the idea of having a second referendum, because referendums are difficult, unpredictable, and can lead you up a blind alley. However, I've described what the political debate is about these issues, but does this mean that Japan is going to indefinitely postpone a debate about how fit for purpose the pacifist element of the Constitution is in the 21st century? Since 1960, Japan has explicitly relied on the Americans to provide its defense under the US's nuclear umbrella. It's provided a base, as Nakasone called it when he spoke to Reagan, your unsinkable aircraft carrier for the US forces of the 7th Fleet. The US relationship remains the most important relationship for Japan. It is existential in any terms. Any wavering of the Americans in terms of their continued commitment to the alliance has been a source of instant concern, not to say panic, in Tokyo, instantly sharpening the debate about whether Japan should take steps to make itself more militarily self-reliant, even if that means acting in a way which alarms its neighbours. Let's also remember, as the very distinguished American scholar Kenneth Pyle notes in his recent book, Japan in the American Century, Asia is now a multipolar region with all the world's principal military powers and several of the key middle powers. The United States, China, Russia, India, Japan, South Korea, Pakistan, and North Korea. 6 of those 8 powers possess nuclear weapons, the other 2 are near nuclear. Japan's nearest neighbours, China and the 2 Koreas, are countries with whom its relations are problematical. Links with China are a bit better than they were six years ago when they were at a nadir, and there is now less rhetoric about the memory of war. The red carpet will shortly be rolled out for Xi Jinping in Tokyo, as it was last month for Donald Trump. With South Korea, the bitterness over the war and the comfort women remains much more difficult to resolve, and the issue is not immune to the tendency of politicians in both countries to play the nationalist card. North Korea, of course, remains a proximate military threat to Japan, and there is still the unresolved issue of Japanese abducted by the North Koreans in the 1970s and 80s, whose fate is still, in many cases, unknown. And there's no multilateral architecture in Asia, such as we have in Europe, within which these territorial disputes, these questions of freedom of navigation, these strategic issues can be discussed and managed. Japanese policy thinkers want to get a balance between being over-dependent on an unreliable United States under a unilateralist President Trump, and Japan's having no effective protection against a resurgent China and a rogue North Korea. So in their terms, the answer is to have a foreign policy which is multi-layered. The US alliance at its heart, effective regional and international groupings, continued strengthening of international institutions, and Japanese diplomacy over the last few decades has continued to support this objective of creating multi-layered protection for Japan in the region and globally. An element of that has to be, I think, for Japan to have the capacity to play a military role in the region in support of the status quo. And that may well require amendment to the Constitution. I think that objective would be supported by Japan's allies. But for that to become entangled with Abe's attempt, or the LDP's attempt under Abe to recast the culture of the Constitution itself, to align itself with a more authoritarian social agenda, that I think would be a bit more problematical. With the abdication of Emperor Heisei in May, former Emperor Akihito, the first such abdication in the modern era, which itself is a source of concern to traditionalists in Japan who disapprove of tinkering with imperial traditions. We are now, as of beginning of last month, in the imperial era of Reiwa, meaning beautiful harmony. The first era name said to have been drawn from classical Japanese literature rather than, with its predecessors, classical Chinese literature. Although some scholars point out that the word appears in Chinese as well as Japanese ancient texts. In general, Japanese attitudes towards the emperor mirror those in most other countries with monarchies, a mixture of affection, respect, and indifference. But all attempts to measure and give meaning to the passage of time invite some introspection, and Japan isn't any exception to that. So I want to conclude my talk with a few words about Japanese identity. As I said at the start, just because Japan is a very homogeneous society doesn't mean that it is a wholly undiverse one, or that there is a general uniformity of view on anything, on everything. But while the polarised political debate we've seen in many Western countries is less evident in Japan, the attachment to finding consensus does mean that it can be difficult for Japanese politicians to manage public debates on issues where opinion is sharply divided. And we saw that, for example, after the Fukushima disaster with the tsunami and earthquake 8 years ago. We saw that with the public debate in Japan on nuclear power. Why do foreign observers of Japan still see the country both as different and unique? Some analysts relate Japan's apparent divergence from cultural norms in other countries to its different spiritual foundation. Instead of, the argument goes, instead of a conventionally theistic religion with a hierarchy of spiritual values ascending to a transcendental deity, in Japan you have state Shinto, which is essentially a pantheistic superstitious cult rather than a religion. The gods are immanent and everywhere. It's not a religion which sets a framework for moral values and behaviour. And other analysts extend this argument with very erudite anthropological, psychological, linguistic analysis, explaining how the structure of the Japanese language, of Japanese society, with its emphasis on obligation, loyalty to the group, a strictly demarcated sense of the security of being inside the home, the group, the family, contrasts with the threat of being outside the home in this dirty, threatening and alien environment. There's an argument that these linguistic and social structures create social norms that prioritise contingent relationships over fundamental values. I can't really condense all these arguments into a couple of hundred words. I mean, some of them are very intellectually persuasive and quite compelling, and yet I can't help feeling that they anyway simplify Japanese society in terms that make it easy for the foreign observer to think that we understand without necessarily reflecting the complexity and diversity of modern Japan, which, as I say again, is a much more diverse and multi-layered society than we have historically thought or like to think. And there are also alternative theories about uniqueness. The Financial Times journalist, who's in Africa at the moment, David Pilling, but he was in Japan for many years, has written very interestingly on this in his essays and books. He argues that this sense of the uniqueness of Japan has a very strong political resonance. He attributes the tensions, for example, between China and Japan to the intellectual break between the two countries during the Tokugawa era. This is the era of seclusion before the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s. In medieval Japan, China was the source of learning and knowledge. It was the source of the written language. It was the source of methods of cultivation, of art and craft. It was the source of concepts of filial piety. As China weakened and Japan strengthened and modernised, Japan sought to draw the main elements of its new society more eclectically from the industrial and intellectual strengths of the West. It began to create a philosophy of, as the Japanese call it, Nihon Jinron, the essence of Japaneseness, the Japanese people, the essence of the sense of being Japanese. State Shinto actually dates from that period, with the emperor at the apex of this cult. There was a famous book written after the Second World War by the American anthropologist Ruth Benedict called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which many of you will know, who drew a contrast between the shame culture of Japan and the guilt culture of Christian societies. Much criticised by some Japanese for simplifying Japanese thought, but very popular in Japan in the sense that she bought into very strongly this sense of Japanese uniqueness. And this sense of Nihon Jinron was really designed to codify this sense of national identity, perhaps even a national myth. And you can see why it accompanied a renewed sense of national purpose. It was important in a society focused on imperial and military conquest, and a society focused on economic regeneration. I suppose the question I finish my talk with is, what resonance does this sense of uniqueness have in a society which is like all Western societies, all developed societies, now managing this process of relative decline and embarking on a new journey to find new international relationships as we come to the end of the American century and perhaps the fundamental US-Japan relationship. There is a fear that this sense of an insistence on uniqueness could underpin a new nationalism, and that lies at the heart of concerns in some quarters about future directions of Japanese politics. And maybe this concern about uniqueness and nationalism is not a subject which is limited only to Japan. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, David. David has very kindly agreed to take some questions from the floor, so I'll open up to the floor.
Thank you for that very interesting lecture. Do you agree?
Oh, sorry. I was looking over your head. I apologise. Sorry.
So just 3 very quick questions. Do you agree that Japan's work in progress, democracy today, threatens its stability in the future? I mean, it's got a lopsided voting system, public debt ballooning, social security, and its society is close to outside talent. And secondly, do you see Japanese politics as being unipolar and over-dependent on Shinzo Abe? Can this unravel in ugly ways? And is Japan's single achievement after the post-war era, do you think, in creating a stabilized, pretty stable middle class that isn't very vulnerable to populism?
Isn't very vulnerable to
populism.
I agree with some of what you say. I think it does have a very stable middle class. It isn't vulnerable to populism. I was always struck by the hostility among a lot of the middle class business people I spoke to and their spouses. Hostility to the intermittent upsurge of attempts at populism from some, mainly on the right. So I think that is true, and I think it is unipolar at the moment because Abe dominates his party, and his party dominates politics. So it is unipolar. Is that going to unravel in an ugly way? I don't see why it should. I mean, your questions are very good, I should have said to preface, because my talk is not a talk which takes a particular view. I'm describing the debate which is going on. I don't myself think that the Abe administration is as sinister as some critics of Abe argue. These critics are, on the whole, analysts whom I greatly respect and whose knowledge and insights I think are important. But they are politically extremely concerned about nationalism, right, which I would share, but I think they are inclined to give the Abe administration the benefit of no benefit of any doubt on these issues.
I meant the weak opposition. That's what I meant.
Well, I mean, in a sense, there is no opposition, and the opposition are irrelevant to the debate. So unipolarity, yes, that is certainly the case. Is that going to unravel in an ugly way? I don't think so, because I suppose the simplistic way of putting this is that the Japanese people have looked over the abyss not necessarily in living memory, but in their parents' and grandparents' living memory, and they will not wish to go down that route again. I think your description, if I may say, initially, of the extent to which Japan is closed to foreign talent and the way and Japan is monolithic, I can see why you say that. It isn't wholly accurate. Japan is more closed to the sort of international interactions that we recognise in Europe and in America for some of the reasons which I hinted at the start of my talk. But it is not wholly closed. And I think that there is a greater intellectual diversity of opinion on some of these issues than one might necessarily see.
Very specific. Sorry, I've got a question here first.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture, David. My wife and I have just returned from an extended tour of Southeast Asia and the Far East on a cruise ship, and ending up in Japan, several stops in Japan, for me the first time I've been to that country. And on one of our tours, most of the passengers on the ship were Americans. On one of the tours, the guide said to those of us on the bus, where are you all from? And most of them were from America, Australia. And when I said I was from the UK, she said, Britain is our mother. And I thought that was rather a striking phrase. Would you like to comment on that? Do you find that attitude at all? And how actually do you think that Japan does think of Britain nowadays?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I suppose the reference is to the Anglo-Japanese Alliance of 1902, and you would be surprised by the degree to which this piece of history, which is almost completely forgotten in Britain, is still recognised in Japan as of phenomenal strategic importance. And I was at a Chatham House meeting last week where Japanese were saying we need a new alliance between Britain and Japan. What does this actually mean? The honest view of Britain at the moment among informed Japanese policymakers is that Britain is tearing itself to pieces over Brexit and committing economic suicide. That is what Japanese policymakers think. They are dismayed by the political and intellectual incoherence of this country. They are almost too polite to say so, but privately they are profoundly concerned by what is happening. And publicly they have made the point very powerfully that however we come out of this mess, they expect the terms of the relationship with the EU to replicate as far as possible the terms of our membership of the EU, which was a main incentive for them to invest in this country from the 1970s onwards, but particularly the 1980s and the 1990s. There are over 1,000 Japanese companies employ 140,000 people directly in the UK, and the Japanese worry about the implications of Britain divorcing itself from the EU for the security and stability of their investments. There is also in that a sense that Japan adapted British parliamentary traditions when they established their own parliamentary system. This is there's a phrase in Japanese, a word oseji, which means you're very polite, but you are paying lip service a bit here. And the Japanese are not being wholly frank when they say, you are our mother, because the mission from the early years of the Meiji Restoration, which travelled around the world, went to America, it went all over Europe, went all over Britain, to look at how developed industrial economies organised themselves, and then eclectically drew the strengths from different systems. The parliamentary system from Britain, the legal system from Germany, other strengths from American and French society. Britain was part of that, but we were not the whole of it. And so when Japanese say, you're from Britain, you are our closest ally, yes, we have been, as part of the European Union for the last 40 years, their closest friend in Europe. That will, I think, end as we leave the European Union, and we will find ourselves competing with other European countries for Japanese attention. So there's a degree of politeness, there's a degree of historical knowledge and reference, and there's a degree of emotional truth, because we are monarchies, we are islands, and there are certain things which psychologically link us in some Japanese minds. So I have simplified a big relationship into a small space.
This is a detailed question. Where did the Japanese sit?
Yes, we can hear you.
Where did the Japanese sit on Taiwan? Is there a unified Japanese view, or are there a number of different views?
Well, it's a good question. I think they sit on Taiwan where the rest of the developed world sits on Taiwan in terms of recognising Taiwan's economic independence and recognising in the non-diplomatic legal sense the fact that it is a vibrant political democracy, without questioning the terms of the status quo between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China, which have obtained for the last 30 or 40 years. Japan will position itself on Taiwan very much, I suppose, where the Americans will position themselves on Taiwan, although they will be alarmed by any indications from Washington under Donald Trump that the US administration's policy is deviating from the status quo which has existed between Taipei and Beijing. Their priority on China is to get the relationship with China back on a more even keel, as I indicated, and they have succeeded in doing that, and the Chinese have cooperated with that as well, because however much there may be political resentment of China's bullying and of China's harping on the war, there will also be concern about long-term economic partnership. China is the most important market for Japanese goods, most important investment centre for most Japanese companies, source of components, economic partner for trade and investment. So whatever the politicians think, in a nationalist sense, the centre of gravity in the debate in Japan will be to establish a modus vivendi with China, and not to allow Taipei to damage that.
Most grateful to you, Sir David, for an inspirational lecture. Do you agree that the Japanese monarchy has achieved much more than the populist leaders and the political parties in Japan in maintaining unity and stability in the country?
I think that the emperor who has just abdicated, Emperor Heisei, as we must now call him, Emperor Akihito, did a considerable amount to rehabilitate the imperial institution. He became, in the words of many Japanese commentators, a social focus who was, in a sense, the consoler in chief. at the time of tremendous national grief with the tsunami and nuclear disaster 8 years ago, it was Emperor Akihito who broadcast to the nation, which is a very rare thing for an emperor to do. It was Emperor and Empress who went to evacuation centres, knelt on the floor to talk to those who'd lost their homes and their families. And there was a humanity and an accessibility to him, which his father, Emperor Hirohito, Emperor Showa, never had. And he also did a lot under strict governmental control, because unlike, to a degree that is, I think, unique among monarchies, the Japanese monarch cannot do anything which is remotely political. So when he paid a state visit to China and met the Korean president, these are statements of a desire to restore the relationship and to reconcile with adversaries, which carry enormous weight. And they represent government policy, but nonetheless the fact that the emperor is doing that is very powerful. Does he provide does he, in your words, do more than politicians to manage stability? I don't know if that's quite the way I would put it. I think you will find in Japan that people respect the emperor, but I don't think that there is any greater emperor worship, if I can use that phrase, in Japan than you would find in other monarchies. Talk to most men and women in the Japanese street. There will be a sense that the emperor and empress, previous emperor and empress, are very decent people. They should be allowed to retire. They're not controversial. They're liked and respected. There's an affection. I don't think it goes much more deeply than that. There is a stability there. There is a stability. I think there are many other political and economic factors which have contributed to this sense of stability in Japan over the last 50 or 60 years. But certainly Akihito did a great deal to restore the reputation of the imperial family after the period of his father, and the inevitable sense in which that was compromised during and after the Second World War. It's interesting, for example, that Akihito visited Okinawa, the southernmost island of Japan, where there was terrible suffering in the last months of the war and massive loss of life. His father was advised not to visit Okinawa, and that, as I discovered when I went to Okinawa myself, was a very bitter memory for many Okinawans.
So maybe at that point we might draw the formal bit of questioning to a close, if I may. But I'm sure, David, would you be prepared to stay back and take some informal
of course.
questions?
I'd be delighted.
Over a cocktail upstairs.
Excellent.
Perhaps.
Thank you.
I'm just aware of the passage of time. And also, maybe one last thing.
Yes.
It's all right. We have, I mentioned earlier on, the recipient of the Sir Percy Sykes Medal, Francesc Vandrell, has actually joined us this evening. So, could I possibly ask you to give
I'd be delighted.
the medal
Thank you.
to the recipient this
Thank you
evening?
very much.
This is the real medal.
On the day that we commemorate Lord Denman, and from the British ambassador in Japan, where my grandparents lived for a long time. I think it's quite blessed.
It's a great pleasure. Congratulations.
So, David, just again, on behalf of the Society, thank you so much for coming and joining us this evening, for speaking at great depth on a subject that I think many of us are really not that familiar with. Fascinating, inspiring, educational, and I think it probably puts to bed one question that I think has dogged the Society for many, many years as to where the Society's boundaries should be drawn. What is the definition of Asia? And I think this has absolutely put that to bed once and for all, and we will remain very much including Japan in our definition going forward.
No, it's a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.